Hey crafters, Jessie Katz Greenberg here with a new craft tutorial for you. This one goes out especially to you art journalers, collage artists, paper crafters, because today we're going to be learning 3 different techniques for paper weaving. I love using these techniques as backgrounds for my collages or for journal pages because they add a lot of texture, color, and interest and sort of get rid of the fear of the blank page before I go ahead and add details on top. We'll learn a basic paper weaving technique. We'll kind of riff on that with some different sized strips. And then we'll also do one, which I don't really have a name for it yet. Maybe it's just kind of sporadic paper weaving, where we use paper weaving just to add a little bit of visual interest to a larger image or photo. If you aren't subscribed yet, be sure to hit the subscribe button to get new craft tutorials almost every week. And if you like this video, go ahead and hit like, give me a comment. It really helps out creators like me who are creating this tutorial content for you. I really, really appreciate it. So without further ado, let's get started and look at some of our supplies. First, you'll need something to paper weave onto. I'm using this cardstock from a pad. It's about 6 by 6, and I like to work at this size or smaller. You could also just use plain paper for this or scraps. Magazines are always a great source for paper weaving materials, or scrapbook paper, metallic or glitter paper. Security envelopes like your bills and junk mail come in have great patterns and texture on the inside. I save all of these. It's a little bit of a problem. Interesting mailers, especially with fun illustrations, origami paper. And I also have a vintage wallpaper sample here. This is from a wallpaper sample book that I got from a neighbor a while back, and it is a glorious treasure trove of collage materials. In addition to all of your paper supplies, you'll also need some glue and some other tools. So I like to use this glue stick. It's the Elmer's Craft Bond. I also love Beacon Zip Dry. It's a really great glue that doesn't wrinkle your paper like most glues do. You could use a paintbrush if you were using other liquid glue like Elmer's, but you won't need it for zip dry. An X-Acto knife, normal number 11 X-Acto blade, a pair of scissors. A cutting mat will be helpful. If you're using an X-Acto blade to cut your pages, you will need a cutting mat. And a ruler. I especially love a ruler with a cork back. It just keeps your ruler still so it doesn't slide around while you're cutting. So always look for a metal ruler with a cork back. We're going to start with a basic paper weaving technique. I teach this in my collage classes, and it's definitely the technique that I use most often. It's a great one for backgrounds in art journaling and in zines. So you'll need 2 different papers for this. I'm going to use the origami paper and the vintage wallpaper. You'll begin by cutting your paper into strips. So I'm cutting strips that are the height of my cardstock. So you want strips that are the height of or the length of whatever you want your final dimensions to be. So you can see these strips are about the height of my cardstock, and you'll want enough strips to stretch across the width. So these vertical strips you're cutting, they would be the warp when you're talking about weaving, the warp versus the weft. The warp are the vertical threads that are attached to your loom. And next we're going to cut strips to go horizontally. So these would be the weft, the strips that go horizontally across your loom, the strips that you are weaving in and out of the warp. So I'm first just cutting my wallpaper down to the size of my cardstock. And then I'll cut those horizontal strips. So my cardstock is almost square, so in this case, the strips are almost the same length. But here I'm making sure that I have strips that are the width of my weaving, so the width of this cardstock. You can see with this first style of weaving, I am not so concerned about the strips being the same exact size or being exactly straight, so I'm just using my scissors to cut them. If you wanted to be more precise, you could use your cutting mat, X-Acto blade, and ruler, and we'll be using that for another weaving technique later on in this video. Now that we have all of our strips of paper cut, we can get ready to weave. So again, we cut strips that are going to go horizontally. That's the wallpaper sample I just cut. And we have strips that are going to go vertically. That's the origami paper that I cut. Here's an example of weaving that I did in a zine. So you can see I have the horizontal strips, which are shorter, and then those vertical strips, which are longer. So things measure to the width and the length of my page. For this first technique, I'll show you how to do it with a glue stick. So I'm using the Elmer's Craft Bond glue stick. If I'm going to be using a glue stick for collage, this is usually my favorite one. I will link it in the caption. So just lay down a thick strip of glue along the top of your canvas and start adding those vertical strips. I like to use a scrap piece of paper to press down my strips. I do this in paper weaving, I do it in collage, it just helps keep my fingers clean. So one thing I want to be mindful of in this particular technique is I don't want to put strips next to each other that were next to each other when I cut the piece of paper. I want this to be a bit more random and sporadic, so that's why I switched out that strip there. Another thing to be mindful of while I am laying down these vertical strips of paper is that I don't want them to overlap with each other. They can be right next to each other, or even better, have a little bit of a space in between each other. If they overlap, then it starts to be a bit difficult when we weave in the horizontal strips. Once all of the vertical paper strips are placed, and again, these vertical strips, if we're talking in weaving terms, these would be your warp. I'm going to go ahead and use that scrap piece of paper just to press everything down, make sure it's nice and secure before I move on to the next step. You'll also notice I'm doing all of this work on a piece of scrap paper. That just helps keep your surface clean, and it makes it so you're less likely to get glue all over the back of your project. We'll start weaving in our first horizontal strip. So you'll notice rather than taking the strip from the side and trying to go over, under, I'm working from the bottom of my page, and I'm just lifting up every other piece of the origami paper. So every other vertical strip, I'm lifting it up, and then I will push up the wallpaper strip to the top of my page. When you're working on a page this large with strips this thin, it can be a little finicky, especially the first one, but as you keep working, it'll get easier and easier. And now you can see that my horizontal strip is going over, under each of those vertical strips. So this next one, I want to go the opposite, where I went over, I need to go under, so that it alternates with that first one. So I'm going to be careful to lift up the opposite strips this time. Again, every other one. It's nice and easy with this origami paper. You'll see when I use thicker paper later on in the video, this part just looks more difficult, but I promise it's not actually more difficult. It just is a little bit more finicky. And then slide that second strip right up against the first strip that we wove in. And now you can start to see this woven checkerboard pattern start to form, where our horizontal strips are going every other one. The papers that I chose here both have these like warm tones and these green tones, so there's not actually a ton of contrast between the vertical and the horizontal stripes, and I really love that for the background of a collage. It creates this just sort of textured look instead of being such a harsh checkerboard. But you could, of course, choose papers that have a bigger contrast to create that really kind of standard checkerboard woven pattern. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see a bit more clearly this woven pattern that we're creating. Once you've woven the entire length of your page, and you don't have to cover your whole canvas, you can always cut off extra at the end, but in this case, I did want the full canvas or full piece of cardstock covered. So I'm just going to weave in my last piece here. You can see that it gets a little finicky at the end just because your vertical strips are shorter. It's really not difficult. It just takes another minute. And with that final piece, the look of our weaving is done. We just now need to secure it down to our page. So grab your glue stick once again, and you're going to very gently lift up this weaving that you made off of your cardstock. You can see the back of this one actually looks pretty fun too. It creates that more contrast, harsh checkerboard. But you're going to cover your cardstock or your paper, whatever you're weaving onto, cover the entire thing with glue. Once that page is fully covered with glue, again, very gently lay back down the weaving that you created. Make sure everything is aligned how you want it to. My lower horizontal strip there started to slide a little bit. And then gently pat everything down with your scrap piece of paper. Notice how I'm patting up and down rather than rubbing the paper, just because I don't want to slide any of my strips around, and I don't want to smear any glue that might be coming up between the strips, between the edges. Do spend a little bit of time on this part, just kind of pressing, making sure everything is attached to your cardstock in the back. You'll likely have some ends on the bottom of your weaving or on the left and right sides that are not adhered to the page. And so you can just gently lift those up, use your glue stick to add some more glue, and then tap those down. Depending on what you're making, you may want to leave the kind of uneven edges that poke out from the sides or from the bottom of your weaving. But in this case, I wanted everything to be flush with my piece of cardstock. So this is the time, once your glue is dried, that you'll go ahead and just trim off those extra edges. And I'm just using the back of my cardstock as a guide. And now you're finished with our first technique for paper weaving. This is a beautiful piece of art on its own. It can be the background of another project. I happen to think these colors would work really great for a holiday card. Popping in just to say, if you've made it this far, thank you so much. I hope you loved the first paper weaving technique. Before we jumped into our second two, though, I wanted to know, what is your favorite collage or art journaling material that is not magazines? So what other sort of paper materials do you love for your collage artwork and your art journaling? Drop that in the comments, and let's take a look at the second weaving technique. The next technique we're going to be learning is kind of a riff on what we just did, but this time, instead of using two textures or two patterns, we want to start with an image, like this illustrated library image here, because we're going to keep this image intact in our final weaving. So you'll start by finding the image that you want to use, and this could be an illustration like I have here. It could be a photo. It could be a pattern, just a floral pattern that you want to keep intact. And you'll cut out your image to whatever size you want your final weaving to be. For this technique, I want to be a bit more precise with my strips. So I'm using my cutting mat, my X-Acto knife, and my ruler. And I'm going to start by creating straight lines on all four sides of the image that I chose. So since I cut it with scissors, it's not very straight, and I just want to kind of slice away any of those uneven edges so we end up with a nice, clean rectangle to start. I've cut out some of the in-between time here, but I do actually spend quite a bit of time lining up the image on the grid of my cutting mat just to make sure that the corners are nice right angles and that I have good straight edges on all four sides. Now we'll begin cutting the vertical strips for our weaving. So I'm just aligning my image up with the grid because this time I want all of my strips to be the same size. So I'm doing, I think it was a 1/2 inch here, and I'll cut 1/2 inch strips of this image. And since I want the image itself to be intact, I'm going to be a bit more careful when I set these strips aside because I want them to all line up next to each other in the order that I'm cutting them. So I'm just recreating this image. Another way to do this would be to not cut the strips fully apart. I could start cutting about a 1/2 inch down right here instead of cutting a full strip. That way this top part would stay attached. It would look kind of like car wash strips that were still attached at the top, but I'm just so used to cutting full strips, I just stick with this method. Next, we'll cut our horizontal strips. So for that, I'm going to use this security envelope, the inside pattern or texture. I have sort of a vision of creating a static version of this library image. And I think this envelope pattern happens to look like static. I think it will look cool woven in between the colorful library illustration. So just like we did with our first image, I'm just cutting off any of the extra white sides of the envelope. I'm going to make sure that everything is nice and straight. So I'm lining up the envelope on the grid of my cutting mat, getting rid of that little white edge, and now I'm going to cut my strips of the envelope. Unlike the first technique we learned, this time I want my horizontal strips to be thinner. This is going to help kind of keep the integrity of the library illustration that we're using as our horizontal strips. So here I'm using, it's like almost 1/8 of an inch thin. I'm doing these very thin strips. It does make it a bit more difficult to weave, but I think the outcome ends up looking really cool. So it's just a way to kind of riff on the traditional weaving that we did in the first part of this video. Since I'm cutting my strips very thin, I do need a lot of them to stretch the whole length of my image, but we're going to space our strips out a bit differently also this time, so we don't need quite as many as you might think. Just like always when we're doing collage and paper weaving, I'm going to put my cardstock on a piece of scrap paper, and this time I'm going to be using Beacon Zip Dry. This is a new mini tube, so you just need to unscrew that top there and then use the cap to poke it open before you replace the cap. So I really love Beacon Zip Dry because it doesn't wrinkle the paper like some glue sticks or some other liquid glue that you might be used to. Go ahead and add a strip of glue wherever you want the top of your weaving to be. In this case, my image is shorter than the height of my page, so I'm going to end up cutting off the top of the cardstock there, which is why I didn't add glue right at the top. Or if we're being honest, you can see that I did add glue at the top, and then I realized I actually want to start my weaving down here. Just like we did with our first weaving technique, you'll lay your strips next to each other right across the top of your page or the top of wherever you're starting your weaving. I'm trying to have my strips next to each other without overlapping, and that also means I'm trying to keep my strips quite straight because I don't want them to be at an angle and then the bottom of these strips overlap with each other. Honestly, I played it a little too close here. I got them right up next to each other, and you'll see later on it makes it a little bit difficult when I'm weaving. So if you leave a teeny tiny space between each strip, you'll have a bit of an easier time than I did. Once all of your strips are glued down, you can go ahead and again use a piece of scrap paper to press everything down and just make sure that it's nice and secure. Now you'll start weaving the same exact way we did in the first technique we learned at the beginning of this video. You might remember that I mentioned how easy it was weaving with the origami paper because it was so thin. This image is a little bit thicker and I'm weaving really skinny strips into it. So it is a little bit more difficult, but I shouldn't even say it's more difficult. This is not hard. It just takes a little bit more time to carefully lift up those vertical pieces. But once you have that strip woven over, under, you can go ahead and slide it up to the top of the image just like we did with our first weaving technique. Be a bit more gentle so you don't tear your very thin strip of paper. It can even help to hold it on the right and left like you saw me doing there and just sort of slide it back and forth. And this is where if I had left a teeny tiny space in between my vertical strips, this would have been a lot easier, but I was stubborn and tried to have kind of a seamless look there with the vertical strips. With this technique, you also don't need to weave the entire way from the top to the bottom of your image. You can choose sort of where these horizontal strips land, so you might not even want to slide yours all the way up to the top. Now I'll continue weaving just like we did in the first technique. At least I'm going to continue that way for now. So my next piece, I wove it over, under, the opposite that I did with the first piece. So now you see when I slide them up next to each other, it's creating not a checkerboard this time, but you can see that effect, the opposite over, under weaving technique. I followed that same method for the first 6 or so pieces that I was weaving in, but then what I really like about this alternate technique is that you can choose how thick you want each horizontal piece to be. So I just wove a second horizontal strip going over under the same way as the strip above it, and it creates a slightly thicker strip. And then with this next one, I resumed going opposite. So I went over under the opposite way of the image above it, or the strip above it rather. This can be a cool way to highlight part of the image that we're trying to keep intact. Like for example, if I wanted, I could line up a bunch of strips now that follow the same pattern as the strip I just used, and it would really sort of frame that woman's face in the illustration. With these really thin strips of paper, it can also be helpful to gently use your fingernail to just slide them up so they're sitting right up against the strip above it. If, like me, you've placed your vertical strips a bit too close together when you're weaving, you can go ahead and just lift them up like I just did, and it'll make it a bit easier to slide those horizontal strips of paper up. And you can see now when I'm weaving, I'm not placing them all right next to each other. I kind of am creating more space between those vertical strips, and I will stack some more on top of each other, right against each other, and it kind of gives this more random static look like what I'm going for, and it helps preserve that background image a bit more as well. Once you're done creating this sort of randomized weaving pattern where you've created some thicker strips and you've left some bigger spaces between your horizontal strips, it'll be time to glue down the back. This is very similar to what we did with the first technique we learned, but this time again I'm using the zip dry to keep my paper nice and flat. It won't wrinkle, it'll help preserve my image a bit more. So add a generous layer of glue to the back of your cardstock and then gently lay it down. Make sure everything is aligned exactly where you want it, and then tap up and down with your scrap paper. Here, the background image that I'm working with is almost like cardstock from that mailer, so I'm able to gently slide the scrap paper horizontally. I wouldn't want to slide it up and down because those thin strips from my envelope are so delicate. And you'll finish your piece by cutting it down to size. So like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to cut off the top part of the cardstock that I didn't use. And in this case, I actually really love how the horizontal strips look. So I'm not even going to trim those. I'm going to leave it exactly how they are. And that was our second weaving technique. The last technique we're going to learn today is where we sort of sporadically weave in and out of one large image. This looks really great with two different textures. So you can see these two examples I have here. I have a flat image and then metallic strips. So for the example that we're going to do together, I'm going to use a magazine image and some glitter cardstock. Begin by selecting your background image. So I'm going to use this night sky image from National Geographic and cut it down to size. The size is determined usually by the page of your art journal. I usually don't do this one on cardstock like you're seeing here as much, but I'll do that for this example. And it does not have to be perfect. I don't usually use a ruler for this. I'm just cutting my strips with a pair of scissors. Once I have my strips of glitter cardstock, I'm going to roughly plan out where I want them to be in my image because we're not weaving across the entire image here. We're just sort of planning some sporadic weaving moments. You'll also cut some of your strips to different sizes because, again, this weaving technique is all about just a couple hints of weaving within an existing image. Once you've taken the time to roughly plan out where your weaving will be, you can go ahead and move those strips aside, and we'll cut a few slices into our background image. The key here is to not cut into the edge of your image. You're cutting into somewhere in the middle of your image. I'm going to cut a few slices or a few strips in the left side and then a few in the right side of my image. Again, I'm not cutting all the way to that edge. And then we're going to weave our glitter cardstock in and out of those openings that I just created. As we add our second strip, I'm making sure to go opposite of how the first strip was. So I'm going over, under in an opposite pattern so it creates that sort of checkerboard. And I'll do the same thing with this third strip. And I'm going to kind of spread this one out so it's not right up against the first two. Again, this is just sort of adding to that randomized effect of this particular weaving technique. The other weaving techniques you can sort of see we were almost creating a fabric. We were creating an entirely new image. Here, we're just accenting the background image that we're using. Once you're satisfied where those details are, where those woven strips are, you can go ahead and glue this down to the page of your art journal or your cardstock or whatever your final weaving is going to live on. I'm using Beacon Zip Dry for this again. Do as I say, not as I do. Remember to always cover your zip dry when you're not using it. I had left it open this whole time, which is why you saw me struggling a little bit to get it out because I didn't take the time to clean the cap and I didn't cover it while I was working. Make sure your image is glued nice and flat and secure down to your page or your cardstock. I'm going to use scrap paper again to help do this. It'll avoid getting glue all over my fingers, but also in this case, it'll avoid getting fingerprints onto my magazine page. And I'm also just making sure that those pieces of glitter cardstock are sitting exactly where I want them and that those are glued down securely as well. If there are any large pieces that are not secure, you can go ahead and just use a little dollop of the Beacon Zip Dry to glue those down individually. Once you're done with your glue, you can go ahead and wipe the nozzle. To keep it clean, I'm just using a piece of scrap paper and then go ahead and replace the cap. If needed, you can trim down the edges. I'm going to trim right down to the size of my background image, and then maybe I'll end up using this piece in an art journal later on. And here you have the third technique, this more sporadic weaving technique where we're really just adding some detail, some geometric interest to our chosen background image. Let's take a look back at what we learned. This was technique number 1, sort of a standard paper weaving. This is my favorite for backgrounds of zine and art journal pages. And like I mentioned earlier, I think this one would be a really great background for a holiday card. Weaving technique number 2 was just a riff on technique number 1. We used different size strips and we almost kept the background image intact, creating this sort of static effect. And technique number 3 was adding woven details to an existing image. So this is a more sporadic or random weaving where we just wove a few strips in and out of an image. Like I said, I use these in art journaling. I use them in collage zines a lot. Here you can see sort of that standard weaving. And in this mini memory book that I made from one of my trips to Craftcation, I use the third technique quite a bit, as well as the first technique we learned today. If you've made it this far, please head to the comments and let me know your favorite collage or art journaling material that is not magazines. All of the metallic silver weaving that you see in this zine, that's all packaging from stickers. It's one of the envelopes from Pipsticks brand, and it just adds such cool texture to your weaving. You could also use paper weaving for bookmarks, for collage bookmarks. I didn't use it here, but I think this would be a great application of any one of these 3 techniques we learned today. And there you have it. Those are our 3 weaving techniques. Like I said, I love using these for backgrounds in art journaling and collage. There can be this fear of a blank page. You don't know where to start, and paper weaving just sort of like meditates my mind. I can sort of zone out a little bit and just look at pretty pictures and colors and kind of do that background process before I start adding details on top. Thanks for watching. You know what to do. Subscribe, like, and comment. It helps out a whole lot, and I will see you with the next tutorial. Happy crafting!